The Galactic Tribunal had executed species before, dozens in fact. Civilizations that burned too bright or too stupidly tended to end up on trial for existential disruption. Humanity was just the latest addition to that list, brought in after accidentally uploading memes into the Galactic Defense Network. The case should have lasted 10 minutes. Instead, it began with one human clearing his throat and saying, "Before we begin, could someone define what constitutes disruption in measurable units?" That was the moment the galaxy learned what a rhetorical trap felt like. The prosecution tried to keep things formal, presenting charts, planetary records, and witness statements from 5 conquered moons. The humans didn't counter with evidence. They countered with questions. Who measured it? Using what standard? Was that before or after you invaded them? Their tone wasn't angry or desperate. It was mildly curious, which somehow felt worse. Every time an alien witness took the stand, a human interrupted with polite precision. "That's fascinating. Could you clarify the basis for your assumption?" No one had ever asked an assumption to defend itself before. The translator units began overheating. 3 linguists fainted. One alien representative began reciting its mating call by accident. Yet the humans pressed on, dissecting every word, every definition, every misplaced comma. When the presiding judge attempted to regain control by declaring, "The tribunal will maintain order," one of the humans smiled and asked, "Order according to whose cultural framework?" It was the most dangerous sentence ever spoken in that chamber. By hour 6, the court's digital recorders had begun looping for memory overload. By hour 12, the prosecution's argument had turned into an existential crisis. And by hour 19, the Galactic Tribunal, keepers of law for 1,000 worlds, had collectively realized that the only way to silence humanity would be to agree with them. The second day of the trial began with renewed determination from the prosecution. Overnight, they had assembled a task force of logic AIs, hoping to counter what they now referred to as the human paradox. Their lead prosecutor, a crystalline being named Vorith, opened confidently with the defendants stand accused of weaponizing creativity, emotional instability, and semantic ambiguity. The lead human blinked, adjusted his glasses, and said, "So, being alive?" The court fell silent. Vorith stammered something about reckless improvisation. The human defense attorney, Ms. Navarro, who had once negotiated ceasefires by convincing pirates they were technically a non-profit, stood and replied, "Improvisation is the ability to respond dynamically to evolving data. You call it chaos, we call it intelligence." From there, the hearing turned into a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as courtesy. Every alien statement was parried not with contradiction, but with escalation. When the prosecutor declared humans were chronically unpredictable, the defense countered, "We prefer the term flexible under duress." When the prosecution accused them of refusing to comply with universal hierarchy, Navarro smiled and said, "We've simply never met one worth following." It was like watching a polite hurricane dismantle bureaucracy. The tribunal's patience began to crack. Judges whispered among themselves. The telepathic stenographer began transmitting expletives directly into the void. Vorith made the fatal mistake of shouting, "You twist every argument." "Only the weak ones," Navarro said calmly. By mid-session, alien jurors were taking notes, fascinated by this new form of verbal combat. The humans had turned a trial into a seminar. When Vorith tried to deliver his closing argument, the logic AIs refused to continue, claiming insufficient consensus on truth parameters. The prosecution rested in shambles. And for the first time in recorded galactic history, the tribunal postponed a verdict. Not for mercy, but because no one could figure out who had just been cross-examined, humanity or reality itself. The transcripts were never meant to leave the chamber. But somewhere between the stenographer's meltdown and the judge's nervous breakdown, the entire hearing leaked onto the galactic infonet. Within hours, it was everywhere, streamed, subtitled, and turned into reaction memes by species who had never even seen humans before. For the first time in millennia, oppressed civilizations heard someone, anyone speak to power without trembling. They didn't just hear words. They heard the impossible sound of defiance wrapped in logic. Across the spiral arm, slave species began gathering around projection hubs. They played the moment Navarro said, "Hierarchy is not law, it's habit." They repeated it like scripture. On mining moons, workers stopped mid-shift and stared at their overseers, quietly asking, "Prove it." On border worlds, planetary governors reported spontaneous debate riots, crowds armed not with weapons, but with questions. Even the galactic translation algorithm began to misfire under the sudden flood of human peak. Words like sarcasm, irony, and gaslighting had no direct equivalent in most known languages. Entire cultures were suddenly trying to figure out what burden of proof meant. The tribunal tried to contain it. They issued press statements labeling humanity as a philosophical contagion. They banned broadcasts, seized networks, and even threatened neural disconnection for repeat offenders. But it was too late. Every attempt to silence the arguments only raised more of them. "If you're right," asked one rebellion leader on live holo feed, "why are you so afraid of letting them speak?" By the time the council realized what had happened, entire sectors had gone quiet. Not from fear, but from refusal. The sound of compliance had vanished. Empires that once ruled by decree now faced petitions, appeals, and, worst of all, open dialogue. The humans hadn't started a revolution. They'd started a conversation. And for the first time in galactic history, the truth was talking back. The armadas came in silence. Whole fleets, gleaming, disciplined, mathematically precise, descended on Sol under the banner of restoring galactic order. They didn't fire at first. They simply broadcast a single ultimatum: surrender Earth and cease all philosophical interference. Humanity's response arrived in a tidy digital envelope labeled Return to Sender. Inside were legal documents so dense that entire AI clerks crashed trying to parse them. The first attachment was titled Preemptive Defense Clause, why you're already in violation. The second was an invoice for unauthorized orbital parking. Within minutes, alien admirals realized this was not a battle. It was an audit. Every communication channel lit up with human lawyers, linguists, and bureaucrats, each speaking with weaponized calm. "You claim jurisdiction," said one representative from the Department of Interplanetary Affairs, "but under whose authority? Please cite statute, subsection, and precedent." Entire command ships stalled as officers scrambled to find legal footing. By the time they located their policy handbooks, the humans had already cross-referenced and invalidated them. The invasion dissolved into paperwork. Missile launch orders were delayed pending clarification of operational ethics. Planetary assaults were halted due to ambiguous sovereignty clauses. One fleet even surrendered when informed that their declaration of war had a typographical error, rendering it a trade proposal. Behind the chaos, human diplomats flooded alien networks with essays, petitions, and procedural complaints. Each was written in impeccable galactic common, meticulously cited, and profoundly irritating. The phrase, "refer to Appendix 47C," became more terrifying than any superweapon. After 48 hours, the once mighty fleets hung motionless over Earth, not defeated but buried under the weight of bureaucratic despair. Their leaders finally transmitted a single plea to the tribunal: "We cannot win." They've lawyered the war. And somewhere in Geneva, an intern smiled, checked a box, and filed the entire invasion under resolve pending appeal. When the smoke, figurative and bureaucratic, finally cleared, the Galactic Tribunal convened once more. Not out of authority, but out of exhaustion. They invited humanity back, this time not as defendants, but as consultants in systemic damage control. The chamber looked like a war zone made of paperwork. Data crystals piled like rubble, judges slumped in ergonomic defeat, and an entire section cordoned off for translators and therapy. The humans arrived fashionably late, carrying coffee and an aura of quiet triumph. Their lead delegate, Navarro, approached the stand with that same infuriatingly calm smile. "We understand you'd like to discuss terms," she said. as if negotiating a software update rather than rewriting galactic law. The treaty that followed became a historical monument to collective regret. It began with routine clauses, ceasefire, reparations, mutual respect, but quickly spiraled into linguistic artistry. The humans introduced terms like eternal diplomatic immunity, pending ongoing discussion, and provisional compliance subject to interpretation. Every alien jurist understood what those meant. They didn't mean anything, which meant the humans could do whatever they wanted forever. The council signed it anyway. They had to. The alternative was more arguing. When the final signature was pressed, Navarro added one last condition. All signatories, she said, must attend an educational seminar on human reasoning. Attendance mandatory. Duration indefinite. The silence that followed was the sound of 10,000 regrets forming simultaneously. Weeks later, the galaxy was littered with posters advertising the human method, a beginner's guide to not losing an argument. Alien scholars debated whether it was propaganda or scripture. Empires quietly disbanded their legal departments out of self-preservation. In the tribunal's archives, someone etched a warning onto the marble dais. They didn't conquer us with weapons. They conquered us with definitions. And every civilization that read and understood the moral the hard way never put a species that invented philosophy, sarcasm, and small print in the same room.